The image is scorched into the stones of the iron citadel. Vaelira is on her knees, surrounded by a swirling crown of embers that refuses to die. The air around her ripples with a heat so intense it has silenced an entire battlefield. To the world, she was a shadow, a broken thing to be discarded. But here, in the center of the flame, she looks like the sun itself. Before the fire, however, there was the ash. In the world of the Emberfall packs, worth is not something you discover. It is something you are assigned. From the moment a child is born, their lineage is mapped, their strength measured, and their utility decided. For the daughters of the High Lords, that utility is absolute. They are the vessels for the next generation of alphas. They are the alliances that hold kingdoms together. They are currency. Vaelira was assigned no worth at all. The verdict arrived on a winter night that felt like the end of the world. The healers' chants had been long, their voices rising and falling like the wind through dead trees. When the warmth finally left Vaelira's body, the healers did not meet her eyes. In Emberfall, they never do when the truth is cruel. The eldest spoke only 5 words, but they were enough to strip Vaelira of her humanity. Her womb is empty. It will never carry life. The word Barren was never spoken, but it filled the room like smoke. It hung in her mother's performative sobs and her father's rigid, white-knuckled silence. In an instant, Vaelira had been erased. She was no longer a daughter or a future. She was a dead end. From that night on, she began to fade. The pack, once warm and boisterous, became a tundra. Conversations died when she approached. Mothers pulled their sons away as if her condition were a disease that could be caught through a glance. Vaelira tried to shrink herself into usefulness. She worked the hardest, spoke the least, and expected nothing. It was not enough. In Emberfall, you do not keep what you cannot use. 3 weeks later, the traders arrived, men in neutral cloaks with eyes like sharpened flint. Vaelira watched from behind a pillar as her father exchanged her life for a handful of silver. He didn't look at her when he signed the contract. He didn't look at her when they bound her wrists. "You'll survive," he had said, his voice as flat as the winter horizon. That's more than most get. The journey south was designed to break whatever was left. First, she lost her hope. Then, she lost her pride. Finally, she lost her name. By the time she reached the market, she was just another piece of inventory on a raised platform. The auctioneer's voice was indifferent, his announcement a death knell for her value. Healthy, no heirs. The bids were low, punctuated by the cruel laughter of men who saw her as a curiosity rather than a person. Vaelira stared at the dirt, ash clinging to her hair, waiting for the final blow. She told herself not to cry. Tears had never saved anyone in the trade. Then, the ground began to tremble. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a presence. The torches lining the market perimeter flared and bent, bowing as if a god had walked into the light. The noise of the crowd vanished, not because they were told to be quiet, but because they no longer dared to breathe. The Alpha King had arrived. Kalen did not look like a savior. He stepped through the smoke and flame of the market torches, his armor darkened by 100 battles, his cloak heavy with the fur of beasts that no longer existed. He looked like judgment itself. His gaze swept the platform once, dismissing the prime stock and the healthy heirs, and stopped. On her. The auctioneer began to stammer, desperate to warn the king that he was looking at damaged goods. "Sire, she is unworthy. She cannot." I know what she was declared. The king's voice cut through the air like a blade. What I want to know is who benefited from that declaration. Silence fell like falling ash. Without hesitation, he paid a price that stunned the crowd, more than the rest of the platform combined. Then he held out his hand. No one had offered Veilira a hand in weeks. No one had offered her a choice. She took it. And the world began to change. What the world called empty was never actually void. It was simply waiting for a spark. The healers of Emberfall had seen a desert, but the Alpha King saw a dormant volcano. Veilira's power had been bound, sealed away by those who feared what she might become. They didn't sell her because she was worthless. They sold her because she was too powerful to control. This is the story of how the girl who was thrown away became the queen who could not be ignored. It is a journey from the lowest pit of human cruelty to the heights of ancient power. Stories like this take many hours to write, structure, and bring to life. If you enjoy deeply crafted narratives like this one, subscribing is the simplest way to support the work. It genuinely helps more than you might realize. Before we follow Veilira into the Alpha King's war-torn lands, I have to ask, do you believe a family's betrayal can ever be justified by tradition, or is it always unforgivable? Veilira's journey south was over, but her trial was only just beginning. She had been bought, but she had not yet been freed. As she stepped into the king's carriage, leaving the market behind, she had no idea that she was walking toward a destiny that would set the entire world on fire. Act 1. In the world of the Emberfall packs, worth was not something you discovered. It was something you were assigned. The hierarchy was a rigid architecture of blood and bone, where your place in the pack was determined before your first breath. To be born into Emberfall was to be part of a machine that prioritized the lineage above the individual. Strength was the currency of the men, but for the women, the only true measure of value was the legacy they could carry in their wombs. Breeding rights were not a choice, they were a civic duty, a holy mandate that kept the pack from fading into the annals of history. In this society, daughters were not merely children. They were strategic alliances, future leverage, and physical vessels for the next generation of alphas. To be fertile was to have a voice. To be fertile was to exist. Veilira understood these rules. She had grown up in the shadow of the Great Hall, watching her sisters and cousins being traded like fine silks between neighboring territories. She knew that her body was the only thing that guaranteed her a seat at the fire and a name in the scrolls. She was the daughter of a prominent house, a girl whose future was supposed to be a bridge between powerful bloodlines. But the universe has a cruel way of dismantling the most meticulous plans. The change began subtly. While other girls her age began to show the telltale signs of the shifting moon and the biological bloom of womanhood, Veilira remained stagnant. She felt a coldness in her marrow that no hearth could reach. The whispers started in the kitchens first, then migrated to the training grounds. By the time her father summoned the high healers, the air in the estate had already curdled with suspicion. The verdict came on a winter night that seemed to pull the very breath from the sky. The great hall was empty, save for Veilira, her parents, and the trio of healers whose presence usually signaled a birth or a death. They had spent hours performing the ancient chants, tracing the ley lines of her blood with fingers that felt like ice against her skin. Veilira lay on the stone plinth, watching the frost form on the high windows, praying for a spark of warmth that never came. When the chanting stopped, the silence was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. The healers stood in a semicircle, their hooded robes casting long, jagged shadows against the hearth. They did not meet her eyes. In Emberfall, the healers were the keepers of the truth, and they knew that the truth they carried tonight would act as an executioner's blade. The eldest healer stepped forward. His voice was a rasping tether, devoid of pity. "Her womb is empty," he said. The words hit the stone floor like lead. "The fire of life does not burn within her. It never will." The word Barren was not spoken aloud, but it didn't need to be. It was written in the way the eldest healer stepped back, distancing himself from her as if her failure were a sickness that could be caught. It was written in the way the fire in the great hall seemed to dim, the flames flickering low as if they too had lost interest in her. Valera's mother collapsed. It was a sudden, violent surrender to grief, her sobs echoing off the vaulted ceiling in rhythmic, desperate bursts. But as Valera watched her, she realized the tears weren't for her daughter's lost future. They were for her own. Her mother was mourning the loss of the prestige a grand wedding would have brought. She was weeping for the shame of having produced a faulty product. Her father was different. He did not weep. He did not shout. He simply turned away from the plinth. His fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles turned a ghostly white. He stared into the dying embers of the fireplace, his mind already moving with the cold, mechanical precision of a man auditing a ledger. Valera could almost see him crossing out her name. To him, she was no longer a person. She was a liability. She was a broken link in a chain that had stood for centuries. In Emberfall, a barren daughter was a dead end, and her father had no use for dead ends. From that night on, Valera felt herself fading into a ghost while still drawing breath. The social death was more agonizing than the diagnosis itself. The pack, which had once been a cacophony of greetings and shared meals, became a desert. Conversations stopped when she approached, the silence following her like a shroud. She would walk through the village and see her childhood friends suddenly find intense interest in the dirt at their feet, rather than acknowledge her presence. The mothers were the worst. They pulled their sons away with sharp, frantic movements, as if proximity to Valera might somehow taint the boy's own prospects. She was a pariah, a living omen of failure. Even the servants treated her with a distant, clinical pity, as if she were a wounded animal that was taking too long to die. Valera tried to fight the erasure. She threw herself into the work no one else wanted. She scrubbed the floors of the keep until her fingers bled and the skin was raw. She tended the fires, mended the banners, and retreated into a state of perpetual, frantic usefulness. She spoke less, took up less space, and ate only what was left over. She thought that if she could become the perfect servant, they might let her stay in the shadows. She thought that if she proved her spirit was strong, they would forgive her body for being weak. It was a delusion. In Emberfall, you cannot earn your way out of a biological deficit. You are what your blood says you are, and hers had spoken its final word. The isolation grew until it was a physical weight. The cold she had felt during the healer's ritual stayed with her, settling deep into her chest. She spent her nights in a small room at the edge of the servants' quarters, listening to the sounds of a pack that had already forgotten she existed. She realized then that she wasn't just losing her status. She was losing her humanity. To her family, she was a failed trade. To the pack, she was a bad omen. To herself, she was becoming nothing. She watched from her window as the winter deepened, the snow burying the world in a layer of indifferent white. She saw the scouts returning and the messengers leaving, all of them part of a grand, vibrating life, that she was no longer allowed to touch. She was a spectator to her own existence, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She knew her father's silence wasn't a sign of mercy. It was the silence of a man waiting for the right opportunity to cut his losses. As the weeks passed, the fear of what was coming began to eclipse the pain of what she had lost. She was a wolf without a pack, a daughter without a father, and a woman without a future. In the brutal logic of the North, there was only one thing left to do with something that had no value. You didn't keep it. You didn't bury it. You sold it. Vaelira lay in the dark, her bound wrists already aching in anticipation of the chains. She thought of the law, the bloodlines, and the cruel certainty of the healers. If you lived in Emberfall, would you follow these rules, or would you be the one to challenge them? She didn't know yet that her challenge wouldn't come from a plea for mercy. It wouldn't come from a change of heart from her father. It would come from the south, riding on the back of a storm, in the form of a king who looked at the world and saw things the healers were too blind to imagine. But for now, there was only the cold, the silence, and the sound of heavy boots approaching her door. Act 2. 3 weeks of silence is a long time to learn how to disappear. In the Emberfall estate, Vaelira had become an expert at it. She moved through the corridors like a draft of cold air, invisible to the eyes of her kin, a living reminder of a failed bloodline. But the silence ended when the iron-shod hooves of the traders' horses struck the frozen cobblestones of the courtyard. They arrived at dusk, 3 men draped in neutral cloaks that carried the scent of wet leather and long roads. They did not bear the sigils of any pack. In the world of the wolves, those who wear no colors are often the most dangerous. They are the men who move the things the world wants to forget. They were polite, their expressions curated into masks of professional indifference, but their eyes were sharp, darting across the architecture of the keep to estimate its wealth. Vaelira stood behind a thick stone pillar in the shadows of the great hall. Her breath hitched in her throat, a small puff of white vapor in the dim light. She shouldn't have been there. She should have been in the kitchens or the laundry, performing the invisible labor that had become her only shield. But a primal instinct, a final flickering spark of her wolf, demanded she hear the truth of her own ending. Her father stood by the hearth, the firelight casting his profile in harsh, jagged relief. Across from him, the lead trader leaned against a heavy oak table, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, hollow sound against the wood. They spoke in low tones, their voices dropping into the gravelly register of men exchanging sins. "She is young," the trader said, his voice devoid of heat, "strong enough for the work. The buyers in the south don't mind a lack of lineage, if the back is sturdy." Vaelira's father didn't flinch at the description. He didn't defend her spirit or her childhood. He simply stared into the flames. "She is barren," he replied, and the word felt heavier than the stones of the keep. "The healers have confirmed it. She will provide no heirs. She is a dead end for my house." "Barren," the trader mused, tilting his head. "That lowers the ceiling. A woman of her rank usually fetches a king's ransom for her womb. Without it, she's just labor. But she'll still sell. The mines always need hands. The kitchens always need backs." The numbers were exchanged then, quietly, like a secret prayer. Vaelira felt a coldness spread from her chest to her fingertips. She was being priced. Every year of her life, every memory she held of this home, was being reduced to a clink of coin in a leather purse. To her father, she was no longer a daughter who had played in the snow at his feet. She was a line item in a ledger that needed to be cleared before the new year. A soft, frantic sound broke the negotiation. Vaelira's mother stepped into the light, her face pale and streaked with the remnants of tears. She didn't look at the traders. She looked at her husband. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She is our blood. We can send her to the distant monasteries. We can hide her in the mountain temples. She doesn't have to be handled like this." It was a desperate plea, but it was hollow. Vaelira realized with a sickening jolt that her mother wasn't fighting for Vaelira's freedom. She was fighting for her own conscience. She wanted a cleaner way to dispose of the shame. She wanted her daughter gone, but she wanted to be able to tell herself that Vaelira was safe behind stone walls, not sold into the nameless void of the south. Her father's gaze shifted to his mate. It was a look of cold, absolute authority. The look of an alpha who had already made his peace with a necessary evil. "The monasteries require a dowry we will not waste on a void," he said. "And the temples do not take those who bring no favor from the gods. This is the only way to settle the debt of her existence." The mother's protest died in her throat. She looked at the floor, her shoulders slumping in a gesture of total surrender. She had chosen her status over her child. She had chosen the pack's approval over her own blood. "Bring her forward," her father commanded. Vaelira didn't wait to be found. She stepped out from behind the pillar, her head held high even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted them to see that she had heard the... She wanted to see the flinch in their eyes. There was none. The traders moved with a practiced, terrifying efficiency. One of them produced a set of iron manacles. They weren't the heavy, rusted things used for criminals, but they were iron nonetheless, cold, heavy, and absolute. As they reached for her, Vaelira looked at her father. She searched for a glimmer of regret, a twitch of a muscle, anything that signaled he was losing something he once loved. He didn't meet her gaze. He looked at the trader's boots. The iron snapped shut around her wrists. The sound was a sharp metallic finality that echoed through the great hall. It wasn't a punishment. It was a procedure. To the traders, she was now cargo. To her father, she was sold. "You'll survive, Vaelira," her father said, his voice as flat as the winter horizon. "That's more than most get. Consider it a mercy that I did not simply leave you to the wolves of the waste." He turned and walked toward the stairs, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He didn't look back. Her mother followed him, her head bowed, her silence a final betrayal. The traders didn't give her time to mourn. A rough hand landed on her shoulder, steering her toward the massive oak doors of the estate. Vaelira stumbled, her boots slipping on the stone she had scrubbed only hours before. She was led out into the biting winter air, the wind whipping her hair across her face. Behind her, the great iron-studded gates of the Emberfall estate began to groan shut. Vaelira turned her head just in time to see the gap closing. The golden light of the hearth, the only warmth she had ever known, was being swallowed by the dark wood. The gates closed with a thud that vibrated in her very marrow. It was the sound of a name being erased. It was the sound of a past being cremated. As the wagon began to move, jostling her against the cold wood of the floorboards, Vaelira watched the silhouette of her home vanish into the falling snow. She was no longer Vaelira of Emberfall. She was nothing. She was a body in a wagon, heading toward a southern horizon that promised only oblivion. She had been stripped of her home, her family, and the very identity she had spent 18 years building. In this moment, as the last light of your childhood home disappears into the whiteout of a winter storm, and the iron on your wrists is the only thing that feels real, would you still hope? Would you search for a reason to keep breathing? Or would the weight of that silence finally break the last piece of you? Vialira didn't cry. Tears were a luxury for those who still had a place in the world. Instead, she watched the snow cover her tracks, leaving no trail for anyone to follow. Not that anyone was looking. She was heading into the dark, and she had no idea that the oblivion she feared was actually the only place where her true fire could finally ignite. But for now, there was only the rattle of the wagon and the long, cold road to the market. Act 3. The journey south stripped Valera of everything the north had not already taken. Hope was the first to go, dissolving into the long, dusty miles of the trade route. Then went her pride, worn away by the rhythmic clink of the iron on her wrists. Finally, her name vanished. By the time the wagons rolled into the southern market of Oakhaven, she was no longer a daughter of Emberfall. She was Lot 402. The market did not look like a place of business. It looked like a wound in the earth. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, charred wood, and the copper tang of old blood. Vialira was led through the crowds toward a raised wooden platform that groaned under the weight of the expendable. Here, the sun felt different, harsh and punishing, illuminating every tear in her stained dress and every smudge of ash clinging to her hair. She stood in a line of 5 others. To her left, an aging warrior with a shattered knee. To her right, a boy too small for his years. Vialira stared at the ground. She had learned that if she focused on a single pebble between her feet, the world around her became a distant, muffled roar. It was the only way to remain standing while the auctioneer began his work. The auctioneer was a man of sharp angles and a voice like grinding stones. He moved down the line with a cane, tapping the shoulders of his inventory as if he were checking the ripeness of fruit. When he reached Vialira, he didn't even bother to lift her chin. He simply gestured to her with a flick of his wrist. "Lot 402, he announced, his voice ringing out over the crowd with a practiced, indifferent cadence. Healthy, strong back, high-born origins, but of no use to any house. He paused, a cruel smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The healers have spoken. No heirs. She is a hollow vessel. The reaction was immediate. Interest, which had been lukewarm, evaporated into a cloud of dismissive laughter. A few minor lords at the front of the crowd turned away to whisper to their aides. A merchant in the second row made a crude joke about the price of a broken jar. 10 silver, someone shouted from the back, more as a taunt than a bid. 12, another yelled, laughing. She can scrub the kennels. My hounds won't mind her lack of a legacy. Valera did not flinch. She had entered a state of emotional numbness so profound that the insults felt like rain on stone. She told herself not to cry. Tears were a form of currency she refused to spend on these people. She was a dead end, a barren thing, a ghost in a dress of rags. She waited for the gavel to fall, for the finality of a life spent in a stranger's kitchen or a dark mine. That was when the ground began to tremble. It started as a low vibration, a hum in the soles of her feet that climbed up through her shins. The laughter in the marketplace didn't stop all at once. It withered, dying out in pockets as the atmosphere shifted. The wind, which had been a hot, dusty breeze, suddenly turned cold, Around the perimeter of the market, the torches flared. The flames didn't flicker. They bent, bowing inward toward the center of the square, as if an invisible weight were pressing down on them. The crowd parted. It wasn't the polite movement of people making way. It was the frantic scramble of prey, sensing a predator. The Alpha King arrived through a veil of smoke and shifting fire. He did not come with a fanfare of trumpets or a parade of golden banners. He came with the silence of a coming storm. Kalen was a man carved from the shadows of old battles. His cloak was heavy with the fur of northern predators, and his armor was darkened by soot and age. He moved with a predatory grace that made the very air feel heavy, like the pressure in one's lungs before a lightning strike. He did not look like a savior. He looked like judgment. Kalen stepped into the clearing before the platform. He did not look at the auctioneer. He did not look at the wealthy merchants or the posturing lords. His gaze swept the platform once, a cold, clinical appraisal that seemed to strip everyone bare. And then it stopped. He looked at Veilira. For the first time in weeks, Veilira felt a spark of something other than despair. It wasn't hope. It was terror. The king's eyes were not dismissive. They were intense, searching, as if he were reading the very marrow of her bones. He saw the ash in her hair and the iron on her wrists, but he looked past them, focusing on something deep within her that she had long ago declared dead. The auctioneer, sensing a shift in his fortunes, began to stammer, "Sire, your Majesty, an honor, but this one, Lot 402, she is unworthy of your coin. She is a waste of your time. She cannot provide what a king requires. She is—" "I know what she was declared," Kalen interrupted. His voice was calm, but it carried a finality that silenced the entire square. It was the voice of a man who did not ask questions he did not already know the answer to. "What I want to know is who benefited from that declaration." The auctioneer went pale. The crowd fell into a silence so thick it felt like falling ash. Kalen stepped closer to the platform, his shadow falling over Veilira like a dark shroud. He didn't look at the auctioneer again. "I will take her," the king said. A nervous ripple went through the onlookers. Someone whispered that the king must be testing the market's honesty. Another suggested he intended to use her as a message to the Emberfall packs. But Kalen did not hesitate. He did not haggle. He paid a sum in gold that was more than the value of every other soul on that platform combined. He bought her as if she were the most precious jewel in the world, despite the world's insistence that she was glass. Then he did something that shattered Veilira's numbness. He didn't order his guards to unbind her. He didn't wait for her to be led down to his carriage. He stepped up onto the rough wood of the platform himself. He stood before her, a towering wall of fur and steel, and he held out his hand. It was a simple gesture, but in the world of the packs, it was a revolution. No one had offered Veilira anything in weeks. Not kindness, not a choice. Certainly not a hand. To offer a hand was to acknowledge equality, or at least a common humanity. Veilira froze. She looked at his palm, calloused from the hilt of a sword, and then up at his face. His expression remained unreadable, a mask of granite and old scars. There was no pity in his eyes. There was only a dark, simmering mystery. He hadn't rescued her. He had claimed her. And in his kingdom, she knew the stakes would be far higher than a simple life of labor. Why do you think the Alpha King chose her? Pity, instinct, or something darker? Veilira reached out. Her fingers trembled as she placed them in his. His grip was firm, grounding her, pulling her out of the world of Lot 402 and into a future she couldn't begin to imagine. As he led her down from the platform, the crowd watched in a stunned, hateful silence. She was leaving the market, but she was carrying the chains of a new master. And as the Alpha King's carriage doors closed, shutting out the sun of the south, Baelira realized that the mystery of why he wanted her was the only thing more terrifying than the life she had just escaped. Act 4. The transition from the auction block to the Alpha King's domain was not a journey into a fairy tale. It was a descent into a landscape of ash and memory. As the carriage crossed the border into Kaelin's territories, the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of distant wood smoke and old iron. These were lands scarred by a war that seemed never to have ended. Fields that should have been golden with grain were blackened stretches of carbon, and the sky held a permanent, bruised hue. Baelira watched the passing wasteland from behind the velvet curtains. She had been given clean clothes, heavy wools and soft linens that felt like a mockery against her skin, and food that her body barely knew how to process. But she had been given no answers. The Alpha King had not spoken to her since the marketplace. He sat in the lead carriage, a silent shadow, leaving Baelira to wonder if she had simply traded one kind of cage for another. The iron citadel rose from the jagged cliffs like a jagged crown of obsidian. It was a fortress designed for survival, not beauty. As they passed through the massive gates, Baelira felt the weight of 1,000 eyes. The king's court was already assembled in the courtyard. A sea of furs, steel, and predatory intent. They did not look like a welcoming committee. They looked like a jury. The hostility was immediate, a cold current that cut through the physical warmth of the keep. As Baelira stepped from the carriage, the murmurs began, a low buzzing sound that carried the sting of hornets. "The king has returned with a stray," a noblewoman whispered, her voice carrying intentionally. She was draped in silver fox furs, her eyes tracking Baelira's every movement with clinical disdain. "And not even a useful one," I heard the auctioneer's cry. "She is a hollow vessel." A warrior beside her, his face a map of jagged scars, grunted in agreement. "We need alliances, not charity cases. The Emberfall line is weak, if this is what they discard. She'll be back in the dirt before the moon turns." Baelira kept her gaze fixed on the stone floor. She was used to being a pariah, but the scorn of the Iron Citadel felt sharper than the neglect of her home. In Emberfall, she had been a disappointment. Here she was an insult. The nobility saw her as a stain on their king's reputation. A foolish indulgence taken by a man who should have been securing the future of his throne with a fertile bride from a warring pack. She was led to a chamber high in the north wing. It was spacious and filled with comforts she hadn't known since childhood, but to Baelira it felt like a waiting room for her eventual execution. She remained silent, watchful, moving through the halls with the practiced invisibility of a servant. She expected to be summoned to the king's bed, to be told the price of her rescue in the only currency the world thought she had. But the summons never came. Instead, she was left to the mercy of the court. At dinner, the noblewomen would leave gaps in the seating, so she sat alone. They would speak of bloodlines and legacies, of grand nurseries and the strength of the next generation, casting pointed glances at her flat stomach. They called her the king's mistake when they thought she was out of earshot. They called her a stain when they didn't care if she heard. Baelira believed them. Why wouldn't she? The healers of her home had been absolute. Her father's rejection had been final. Everything in her life had reinforced the idea that she was a broken thing, a temporary guest in a world of functional people. She lived in a state of perpetual bracing, waiting for the moment Kaelin would realize his error. She waited for the night he would look at her and see the same dead end her father had seen. But the Alpha King was a shadow that loomed over her days. He did not join in the mockery, nor did he stop it. He simply observed. Vialira would catch him watching her from the high galleries or the end of the long dining table. His gaze was not the hungry look of a man who had bought a plaything. It was the look of a scholar studying a riddle, or a general watching a horizon for a sign of an approaching army. He saw her shrink when the warriors scoffed. He saw her flinch when the noblewomen laughed. And yet, he remained silent, his expression a mask of granite. One evening, as she walked the perimeter of the courtyard, she passed a group of young soldiers practicing with flaming brands. The smell of the oil and the roar of the fire sent a strange primal shiver through her. For a second, the coldness in her marrow, the coldness that had been there since the healer's verdict, throbbed with a dull, aching heat. She stumbled, her hand catching on a stone wall, and for a heartbeat, the gray granite felt as hot as a forge. She pulled her hand away, gasping. The stone was cool to the touch. She looked at her palm, expecting burns, but found nothing. "Is the air too thin for you, little ghost?" She turned to find Lady Elara, the woman in the silver furs, standing a few feet away. Elara's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You look pale, even paler than usual. Perhaps you should return to your room. It would be a shame for you to collapse before the king tires of his new pet." "I am fine," Vialira whispered, her voice sounding small even to her own ears. "Are you?" Elara stepped closer, her scent of lavender and sharp musk overwhelming. "You are a mistake, Vialira. A beautiful one, perhaps, but a mistake nonetheless. In this kingdom, we value what we can use. And you? You are a vessel with nothing inside. Enjoy the silk while it lasts. The king will find a real mate soon enough, and you will be back in the ash where you belong." Vialira didn't answer. She couldn't. The woman's words were merely an echo of the voice inside her own head. She retreated to her room, locking the door and sinking onto the bed. She felt the heavy wool of her dress, the softness of the rug beneath her feet, and felt like a thief. She was waiting for the floor to drop. She was waiting for the safety to collapse. She didn't know that the heat she had felt in the courtyard wasn't a fever. She didn't know that the coldness in her chest was not a void, but a dam. Inside her, something ancient was pressing against the walls of the seal her parents had placed on her soul. The fire was waking up, and it was starving. If you were Vialira, surrounded by people who prayed for your failure, and a king who watched you in a terrifying, heavy silence, would you trust this safety? Or would you sleep with your boots on, waiting for the moment you were thrown back into the dark? Vialira chose the latter. She remained a ghost in a house of wolves, unaware that the very thing they mocked her for, the emptiness in her soul, was about to explode into a light that would blind them all. The court thought they were looking at a victim. They didn't realize they were sharing a keep with a dormant sun. And the king? The king was simply waiting for the first crack in the ice. Act 5. The peace of the Iron Citadel did not break with a whisper. It shattered with the roar of a siege. The Shadowclaw pack struck at the deepest point of the night. They were an old enemy, a swarm of marauders who moved through the smoke of their own burning brands. The outer defenses crumbled under the weight of their ferocity. Torches were tossed into the haylofts, and the scream of clashing steel tore through the quiet halls. Panic, sharp and metallic, flooded the keep. Vaelira woke to the smell of pitch and the sound of splintering wood. She did not wait for a guard. She knew, with the instinct of the discarded, that no one was coming to save the spoil of the court. She fled her chambers, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone, navigating the chaos of a keep in its death throes. She burst into the central courtyard just as a group of invaders breached the western gate. She was cornered. To her back, the stone walls of the citadel. Before her, 3 warriors with blades that thirsted for the king's blood. The heat of the burning keep pressed against her, and the air was thick with soot and flying embers. Vaelira fell to her knees in the center of the courtyard, her hands scraping against the ash-covered ground. Fear is a powerful catalyst. For years, Vaelira had lived in a state of suppressed terror. A girl who had been told her internal fire was extinguished. But as the invaders closed in, that fear reached its breaking point. It didn't make her scream. It didn't make her beg. It cracked the very foundation of her soul. Inside her chest, the coldness she had carried since that winter night in Emberfall didn't just melt. It exploded. The flames around her, the ones eating the timber of the gates and the oil of the torches, did not move outward. They surged toward her. They bent and swayed as if caught in a sudden violent vacuum. The invaders froze, their blades hovering in midair. They didn't see a victim anymore. They saw the fire of the courtyard responding to the girl on her knees. Vaelira let out a sound that was less a cry and more a roar of ancient power. The heat wrapped around her skin, but it did not blister. It did not burn. It sang. It felt like a homecoming. Power, long suppressed and starving for release, tore through her veins like liquid sunlight. The gray ash on her skin turned to gold as the embers settled into her hair, forming a crown of shifting light. The shadow claws fled. They did not run because of the king's guards or the fortress walls. They fled because the girl they intended to slaughter had become a pillar of living flame. The Alpha King arrived just as the courtyard reached its peak of impossible light. Kaelin stepped onto the gallery, his sword drawn and stained with blood. He stopped. The battlefield stilled. Warriors from both sides lowered their weapons, their faces illuminated by the white-hot radiance emanating from Vaelira. Kaelin didn't look shocked. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a man who had finally seen a ghost become flesh. The healers were summoned before the fires had even been fully extinguished. The same clinical detachment they usually employed was gone, replaced by a shaking, pale-faced terror. They worked in the great hall, their instruments flickering in the light of Vaelira's lingering aura. The eldest healer's voice was a mere whisper when he finally spoke. She was never Barren. The words rippled through the hall, silencing the murmurs of the nobles who had mocked her. Her power was bound, the healer continued, his fingers trembling as he gestured to the faint, jagged scars on Vaelira's wrists, scars that had been hidden under the iron of her shackles. A seal was placed on her blood before her first shift. It was a deliberate, complex binding. Her body wasn't empty. It was holding back a sun. All the energy that should have gone toward her maturation was being used to keep the seal from shattering. The revelation was a second explosion. Vaelira sat on the stone dais, her breath hitching. The truth was far more monstrous than the lie. Her parents hadn't just been disappointed. They had been complicit. They had seen the phoenix fire in her eyes when she was a child, and had chosen to smother it. They had traded her life for the safety of a secret, preferring a barren daughter they could discard to a powerful daughter they could not control. The Alpha King descended the steps into the center of the hall. He moved slowly, his heavy boots echoing on the stone. He stopped in front of Vaelira, the smoke from the battle still clinging to his furs. The court watched, breathless, as he looked down at the woman they had called a stain. He extended his hand. It was the same hand he had offered at the marketplace, but the meaning had shifted. "You were not broken," Kaelin said, his voice low and resonant, carrying to the furthest corners of the room. "You were feared." He didn't look at the nobles. He didn't look at the healers. He looked only at her. "They told me I was buying a ghost," he said. "I knew I was buying a revolution. I was simply waiting for you to realize it." In that moment, the hierarchy of Emberfall and the scorn of the Iron Citadel meant nothing. Vaelira looked at the hand of the king and then at her own, where the skin still hummed with a golden warmth. She saw the path behind her, the rejection, the chains, the auction block, and realized they were all part of the same cage, a cage built by her own blood. After learning that her own parents had bound her power and sold her into oblivion to keep her small, should Vaelira ever find it in her heart to forgive them, or should she never look back? Vaelira did not take his hand immediately. She stood up on her own, her eyes burning with a light that no healer could ever chant away. She looked at the king, and for the first time, she didn't see a master. She saw a destiny. The truth was out. The fire was awake. And the parents who had signed her away were about to learn that you should never sell something you haven't truly managed to kill. Act 6. The silence following the healer's words was a physical weight. In the great hall of the Iron Citadel, the air still tasted of ozone and spent flame. The noble women who had sneered at Vaelira's lineage now clutched their silks, their faces pale reflections of the ash on the floor. The warriors who had joked about her lack of value stood paralyzed, their hands hovering near hilts they no longer felt certain of. The revelation was not just a medical correction. It was an indictment of every tradition the North held sacred. Vaelira remained in the center of the hall, the golden hum in her blood slowly settling into a steady, rhythmic thrum. She was no longer the girl who had arrived in a trader's wagon. The soot on her skin looked like war paint. The tattered remains of her dress looked like a shroud she had outgrown. She looked at the court, and for the first time, she did not see a jury. She saw a room full of people who were terrified of a girl they could no longer explain away. The Alpha King began his descent. Kaelin moved down the stairs from the high gallery, his heavy boots striking the stone with the deliberate cadence of a drum. He did not look at the healers. He did not look at his advisors. His focus was locked on Vaelira, his expression a mixture of dark satisfaction and ironclad intent. He reached the floor of the hall and walked through the crowd. They parted for him like water before a prow, a wide circle forming around the king and the woman the world had tried to erase. He stopped 3 paces from her. The smoke from the courtyard still curled around them both, weaving their silhouettes together in the flickering torchlight. "Listen well," Kaelin said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a resonant authority that seemed to vibrate the very foundations of the keep. "For weeks, you have whispered. You called her a mistake. You called her a stain on this throne. You looked at a power so ancient it predates your laws, and you called it a void." He turned his head slowly, his gaze raking over the noble women who had mocked her and the soldiers who had dismissed her. "You were told she was broken," he continued, his tone dropping into a dangerous low register. "You were told she was empty because that was the only way those who feared her could sleep at night. They didn't sell her because she was worthless. They sold her because they were cowards. They bound her because they knew that if she ever woke up, their world of neat little bloodlines and convenient alliances would burn." Kalen stepped into her space. He did not tower over her as a master. He stood before her as a witness. "You were not broken, Vialira," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "You were feared." Then came the claim. It was not the desperate move of a man seeking an heir, nor the pity of a savior. It was a ceremonial acknowledgement of destiny. Kalen reached out and took her hand, not to lead her, but to bind his fate to hers before the eyes of every witness in the citadel. "Before the moon and the fire," he announced, his voice carrying to the rafters. "I claim her, not as a guest, not as a ward. I claim her as the heart of this keep. Let the word go back to the north. What was discarded has been reclaimed. What was bound has been set free. And anyone who dares to question her worth again will answer to the fire she carries and the king who stands beside her." The reversal was absolute. Lady Ilara, the woman in the silver furs who had called Vialira a pet, took a frantic step back, her eyes darting toward the exit. The warriors bowed their heads, a silent, collective surrender to a power they could not compete with. The air in the hall shifted from the cold hostility of a courtroom to the heavy, reverent heat of a temple. Vialira did not kneel. She stood beside the Alpha King, her spine straight, her hand steady in his. The weight of the world's judgment had been lifted, replaced by the terrifying, exhilarating weight of her own potential. She looked at the faces of her rivals and saw only small, frightened people, clinging to a status that no longer mattered. The girl who had been traded for silver was gone. In her place stood a woman who had survived the ash to find the flame. Kalen squeezed her hand, a silent signal that the public theater was over, but the work was just beginning. The North would hear of this, her father would hear of this, and the parents who had tried to bury the sun would soon realize that the dark does not last forever. As the Alpha King led her toward the high dais, Vialira looked back at the great hall one last time. She saw the fear in their eyes and realized Kalen was right. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever felt for her. The time for hiding was over. The world had assigned her no worth, so she would simply have to take everything for herself. The message was clear. Vialira had risen. Now it was time for the rest of the world to fall. The heavy iron doors of the throne room swung open, admitting a draft of cold northern air that smelled of impending snow. 2 guards led the prisoners forward. They did not look like the high-ranking nobility Vialira remembered from her childhood. They looked small, swallowed by the immense shadows of the Iron Citadel's rafters. Her parents had been brought from the Emberfall borders in the same kind of nondescript wagon they had once used to discard her. Now, standing on the polished obsidian floors, they seemed to shrink. Her mother's fine silks were frayed, her face a map of frantic, hollow grief. Her father walked with a rigid gait, his eyes fixed on the floorboards as if the sheer weight of the Alpha King's presence might crush him if he dared to look up. They reached the foot of the dais and collapsed. It wasn't a gesture of respect. It was the physical surrender of people who realized their lives had finally run out of room. "Vialira," her mother sobbed, the sound echoing thin and desperate against the stone. We did it for the pack. We did it for you. We feared what that power would do, how the world would hunt you if they knew the truth." Her father spoke then, his voice stripped of the cold authority he had used to price her life behind a stone pillar. "Tradition demanded it. We chose survival. We thought you would find a quiet life in the south, away from the fire that would have burned us all." Vaelira did not answer. She sat in the high-backed chair beside the Alpha King, her hands resting calmly on the armrests. Silence can be a vacuum, but in this room it was a weapon. She watched them weep. She watched them reach for justifications that sounded like ash in the wind. To them, she had been a problem to be solved, a liability to be sold. Now, she was the judge they never expected to face. For years, she had imagined this moment. She had thought she would scream. She had thought she would demand an apology for every day she spent feeling like a defect. But as she looked at the two trembling figures below her, she felt a profound, quiet clarity. She didn't need their apology to be whole. Their betrayal was the soil, but she was the harvest. She looked at the Alpha King. Kalen was watching her, his expression unreadable, leaving the judgment entirely in her hands. He had given her back her name, her power, and her throne. Now he gave her the final piece of her freedom, the right to let them remain in the past. Vaelira stood up. She did not move toward them. She did not offer a hand of forgiveness, nor did she signal the guards for an execution. To punish them would be to acknowledge they still held power over her heart. To ignore them was to prove they held none. She simply turned her back, her gaze shifting to the horizon visible through the high windows. In the world of the Emberfall packs, worth was assigned by others. But as Vaelira stood beside the king, silhouetted against the great hall's flickering fire, she knew the truth. Worth is not something given by a healer's chant or a father's ledger. It is the fire you refuse to let them extinguish. They had thrown her away as nothing, but from the ash of that betrayal, a queen had risen. She would be a force of balance in a world of rigid, cruel hierarchies, a queen whose power was no longer a secret, and whose truth would never be silenced again. The world had tried to bury the sun, only to realize that the dawn is inevitable. Vaelira's journey from the auction block to the throne is a reminder that our lowest points are often just the preparation for our greatest ascensions. She had been sold into oblivion, only to find her destiny. If this story of fire and justice moved you, please take a moment to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Crafting these narratives takes many hours of writing and production. If you want to see more stories of the rejected finding their worth and the silent finding their voice, subscribing is the best way to support this channel. It genuinely helps more than you know.